have an interesting history in my career in supply chain. I started off with South African breweries as a chief engineer, and then went on to manufacturing strategy and supply chain strategy, then came out to AMR Research, led and built the supply chain practice. We've formulated the whole concept of a demand-driven supply chain. Then I went off to Accenture for a couple of years as a partner in supply chain, and then Rod Johnson reached out to me and said, come and join us at Oracle. Very exciting, and I'm going to start off the way I'm going to run this panel. I'm going to ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves, and we've got a really diversified group here, and that's what's actually quite exciting. Then I'm going to ask them, as they introduce themselves, to start off with a key thought. And then we'll ask some questions. I'm going to tee up Bajit for something to talk about some of the emerging market supply chain scenarios in Africa, and Maeve is here to talk those through as well. And then I'm going to close off about 5 minutes early, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to leave you with a key, insightful recommendation. So very quickly, and I'm sure all of you have seen this slide. So if you've seen it, you're going to see it again. So what is the end-to-end supply chain? This is it. It starts with suppliers, contract manufacturers, your own manufacturing sites. The red box is planning, and the gray box on the left-hand side is customers, patients, consumers, buyers. So the change and the point behind this slide is what you see is the black arrows, which is inside out. In other words, supply-driven. I make stuff, and I hope like crazy that it goes to the right place. But that's changing, because there's a pivot involved. There's a pivot from supply-driven to demand-driven. You know, if you're Walmart, you're really worried about Amazon and the agility that Amazon could use to compete against Walmart in their own game. And that's why they're clamping down on their suppliers. They have to be super agile to be able to compete with someone shopping at Amazon on the web. So now comes the outside in, demand-driven. What information are we getting back around our supply chain? Merck and Walmart share pollen data, they share weather data, they share inventory data, they look at see what people are saying about allergies on Facebook, and they move inventory. That's the future. Very exciting. So this is the supply chain, and the key point is we're pivoting from supply-driven to demand-driven, and the argument is most companies are so complex in terms of their systems that building this is a nightmare. So the idea that I could have one overarching cloud over this end-to-end supply chain is what got me to join Oracle. Next slide. This is a journey, and you're going to hear it from these folks on the panel. And it's a 5-stage journey, and it involves growing your capabilities from reacting to problems, to projects to solve silos of problems, things like inventory costs, quality problems, to stage 3, which is collecting those projects and driving functional excellence. You kind of heard this in Jamie's presentation, right? Because that's exactly the journey that they followed. And so stage 3 is functional excellence, logistics excellence, manufacturing excellence, planning excellence. But stage 4 becomes that complete transformation of the supply chain, where I go from these silos of projects and functions to an end-to-end supply chain. And the key point, and I'm going to ask Stuart to tell you about the focus at Schneider around the customer. The key point is the supply chain starts with the customer and goes back to supply. And that's stage 4. And very few companies get there. A lot of them get stuck in stage 3 because IT complexity, not enough leadership, there's no vision for, how do we do this? It's real difficult stuff. Okay, good. So without any further, and then stage 5 is orchestration. So a couple of examples of companies and where they are. Dell, classic example, stage 3, and they're trying to get to stage 4, obviously. Companies in stage 4, Procter & Gamble, Samsung, Unilever's probably a low stage 4, Amazon, Apple. These are companies who've made the mental model switch to start with the customer, build the end-to-end supply chain, and transform the business operating model. Okay, so without any further ado, what I'm going to ask the panelists to do is introduce themselves, the role they have, and start you off just with one provocative thought. Dave, off we go.
Good morning. I'm Dave Aquino from Barco Uniforms in Los Angeles. I don't have any problems anymore after watching that prior presentation. My issues in supply chain technology are not that bad, so I don't need life or death. But I think the transformation in terms of digital, technology. We're an 88-year-old family-owned company, small organization. I've been at Pepsi and Unilever. And the challenges of survival in a smaller company, we support healthcare industry, nurses, doctors in developing great uniforms that fit great, that have performance. Our survival is based on innovation and on disrupting the marketplace. And so our work is finding ways to disrupt positively, but create reliability in a very complex supply chain that's global, whether we're producing in Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam. So our requirements are how do we improve transparency and innovation on a smaller scale and taking advantage of some of the capabilities and technologies that are out there today. So it's very exciting. And the world has gotten a lot smaller for sure.
Yep. So Bob, an ex-peer of mine at AMR Research Partners. So let's hear, as an analyst, introduce yourself and give us a starting thought.
Glad to. And good morning, everyone. I'm Bob Ferrari. Very cool name that gets good tables at restaurants, especially in Europe. I sort of cut my passion for supply chain in the military, where supply chain and logistics is a big deal, and you'll learn that quite quickly, and it gets in your DNA. Then I, cut my stripes as over 20 years in industry supply chains, primarily in high tech. And then became an industry analyst, as Roddy mentioned, AMR days, now Gartner. Then went into the technology community, came back out as part of IDC. And then I made my transition because we're all disrupted. So I wear two personas. My first persona as the independent industry analyst that's got the gray hair and has been around and seen a lot. Sometimes I say I've seen this chapter before, chapter and verse, whatever it may be, from technology companies and things like that. The second persona for the last 8 years now has been as a blogger, and my platform has been the Supply Chain Matters blog. And I use that as the observation template for how supply chains react to business change. What does it mean to their business processes? What does it mean to their technology? What can we learn from this? And you wouldn't believe the quest for knowledge around that, and the numbers sort of read that. So the thought I want to leave with you to start off, something to think about, maybe the panel will address. Roddy shared with you the maturity curve. And for years, as an industry analysts, we've always showed you various forms of that. But there was always one common message consistently, those of you who've been following it, everybody was stuck in the middle, as Roddy pointed out, for various legitimate reasons. Now, to move forward into those things that really needed to count and where they wanted to go, it was all sort of internally driven, internally motivated, continuous improvement, all those kinds of things that you heard about. The thought I want to leave with you today, and maybe we can talk about that, is that now I think that's going to change dramatically. It's not internally driven anymore. It's externally driven.
Good, and I think on that point, witness all the, if you're a Nutella fan and you didn't know that a retailer was going to drop their price by 70%, and then there's riots because everybody wants their bottle of Nutella. That's what supply chain's all about. Who could have predicted that? So Maeve, introduce yourself, and Maeve brings a very interesting perspective on supply chain to the panel.
Thank you, Roddy. So I'm definitely a supply chain veteran. I started my career with Wang Computers, if any of you remember them, but cut my teeth at Dell during a very formative time during the supply chain. Since then, I've led the supply chain activities with the Bill Clinton Foundation, and more recently guided the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation around their supply chain strategy for transforming global healthcare. So currently, well, I guess, first of all, the thought, as I said yesterday, I feel like that we've been talking about supply chain transformation for a long time. But I do think it is different this time around. And I think the reason it is different is because of digital, because of the cloud. I think also it's different because of the workforce. The workforce is changing dramatically, and we will see significant shift in the next decade over that. And also the speed with how that's happening. So for me, I'm involved in the transformation of the global health supply chains, and most of that is in developing countries or frontier markets. And what's interesting, when I look at the maturity model, most of those don't even get to the stage 1 or stage 2. In fact, we've created a subset of the maturity model to cover where some of these countries are. But the good news is their ability to leverage disruptive technologies is actually going to allow them to move pretty quickly through the maturity model. And we're already seeing some of that, and I think we're going to talk about it today.
Yeah, great. Damon.
All right, thanks, Roddy. So my name's Damon Wenger, work for Office Depot, lead the IT areas in finance, supply chain, and corporate systems. I thought I was up here as a kind of inspirational leader. I'm not a supply chain expert, but I cover a lot of areas, and after following that last act, I'm not sure. But what I can tell you is transformation, and the transformational journey that you have to go on is very different than it was before. I think the key thought along those lines is, and think about what we've gone through, a traditional retailer, and look around at the retailers that are left in any industry or any vertical. We are reinventing ourselves in the services space, not losing our core, but figuring out how to reinvent and leverage our supply chain within services and products. And in order to do that, you need transformational leadership, not the kind of the past within IT where you can buy a big ERP from Oracle and set that vision and then not worry about it for the next 5 years from a visionary perspective. It's daily. It's being positive, right? And then being not afraid to ask the hard questions, not afraid to ask, kind of, as Jamie said, the whys. Like a real practical example could be, right, this conference has been excellent, right? I think everyone's enjoyed it. You learn a lot, but my question to Roddy or maybe Glenn would be, why would they have us follow Jamie? We should have been first.
Stuart, on that note. Stuart,
Yes.
Introduce yourself and go straight into the first question, which I'm going to ask you. As Schneider, making PLCs and computers and standby battery power supplies, talk a little bit about what does Schneider transform against? What's the pivotal point for Schneider in your transformation?
Okay, well, thank you, Roddy, and good morning, everybody. My name is Stuart Whiting, and I've been part of the leadership team for the transformation of Schneider's supply chain in the last 5 years. And it really is taking in the comments of Bob and Maeve at the outside in, so bringing the customer into the supply chain, and leading what I call a tailored, sustainable, and connected response within the supply chain to the engagement and how we interact with those customers. So to answer the questions that you just posed there, Roddy, it happens in 2 ways. It's one thing with our products. For example, we make 400 million breakers a year, which are distributed. And those get all put into people's houses, industrial premises, and residential, commercial, leisure. And it's about connecting those products and then putting in the analytics behind it that can really make the facilities managers, the people that manage those infrastructures' job easier, but be far more responsive, be it hospitals, schools, big industrial complexes, and so forth. Now, that's one thing. That's the products and the systems that we put into the marketplace. But then it's actually the connection of the customer through their journey in procuring services or systems or products from Schneider. So how do we create from order to delivery the glass factory where a customer can see, particularly on a solution or bespoke product set, the manufacturing of those goods, even doing remote FAT within that factory, right through to the delivery and the installation of those products or parts or systems to the customer. The other thing is then recognizing those customers have got multiple different buying behaviors. Some are lean, some are agile, some are collaborative. You've got big projects, these big green cities that are being built and the energy management that goes behind them, or hospitals or schools that we also support. So each of those are very bespoke solutions that need to be managed in a very careful and delicate manner, through to how do we then respond to major disasters or natural disasters that are there, or port explosions, or collisions of boats and harbors and everything else, and making sure the supply chain knows where their products and services are at any given time. So it's multiple, really, Roddy. It's one, how do we connect to the customer, not just from the point of view of the sale of the product through the supply chain and the communication of that, but it's also making sure the products, once they're in there, are connected not just to the customer, but back to the source, so that we can proactively manage that relationship going forward.
So getting the circuit breaker out to multiple layers of people who are buying and distributing, but then connecting the information back to Schneider so that you can learn from that channel, you can influence that channel. Great point. So I'm going to ask Dave, as COO, CIO, Chief Supply Chain Officer. Dave has a fascinating story about making uniforms, putting together scrubs, etc., in emerging countries, and some of the digital technologies that you use to prevent somebody sewing a child's large to an adult large scrub. How do you stop that happening?
Well, we're producing in Africa and Asia, as I mentioned, and we have global licenses. So ABC Disney, our big brand for scrubs and honoring healthcare workers, is Grey's Anatomy. We also have a partnership with Skechers. So the world-class companies that we work with, they expect high compliance, high demand. They're licensing their brands to us, and they expect quality. And our mission is about great fit, great innovation, great execution. Apparel is still a very hand-sewn product. It's not automated. We're working in developing countries. So the technology capabilities now, even though we're producing in Africa, Vietnam, China, Indonesia, is to bring some technology that will facilitate artificial intelligence, being able to look at garments being sewn and identify faults faster than human hands or human eyes. There's a lot of supervision still, because it's a labor play. There's a lot of supervision that probably can be taken out of that process to be able to have cameras and learning in terms of machine learning, being able to look at garments, say, that's not to spec, let's stop it in line rather than at the end of the day. When you get a container of 40 or 50,000 units of product and it fails, and we do inspection after inspection and inspection, it slows down your process and your availability. So ultimately, embedding technology, even in a developing world, offers tremendous step change or quantum leap forward for our capability.
It's a fantastic story. So in other words, if I take a small sleeve and start sewing it onto an extra large body, the system's going to say, well, stop, something's wrong. Great. So I'm going to ask Maeve now to talk about what's different in the emerging markets, and in particular Africa, because there's some pretty exciting stuff, and I think Brigitte is in here somewhere. I don't see, oh, she is there. So I'm going to ask Brigitte, who leads the Eastern EMEA supply chain group and does a lot of work in Africa, to talk about how people just underestimate what Africa is all about. So let's start with Brigitte, position the discussion we had this morning.
Thank you, Randy. I was really privileged because it's an opportunity that you gave me to go to Africa. By the way, I'm Baljeet, and I cover supply chain for EMEA. And Roddy, you and John Chorley actually, said to me, okay, Baljeet, you're going to Africa. Why don't you do an overview session for the startups? And I did, Randy, and I was so surprised. We guys are taught about, how many of you or us have sat and learned the Oracle Cloud strategy? And we fear sometimes even articulating that. So whilst I was doing this in Africa, so Roddy was in Kenya, Ethiopia, West Africa, and these were the supply chain startups. And you know what? I fell off my chair, because these guys were so smart that they have leveraged the cloud. They were talking the cloud strategy, and it was fascinating. And what they also did, Roddy, they're using Java skills, and they're leveraging our platform as a service, and they have actually built applications, sophisticated applications, to actually just lift and put it on the cloud. And moreover, you know what? Because it's Africa, And in Africa, it's a beautiful part. I'm an African, by the way. It's beautiful. And they speak really good English. Maybe you want to talk about it.
Yeah, and so I'm going to pivot to Maeve. But you don't have to build elephants and lions into your supply chain strategy, right? Because I think people think they walk around the streets. That's not the case, right? Yeah. So Maeve.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of misperceptions about Africa, and I guess the first one is it's not a country, it is a continent. There are actually 52 countries, roughly. And with that, there's a lot of different cultures. So when you work in different countries, you do have to understand the culture for those countries. What has been amazing for me, a couple of things. One, the people. When you go to places like Kenya and Nigeria, they're so entrepreneurial. They really just want to go and get stuff done, and they won't wait around. They're not going to wait around for others to do it for them. Two, and I guess it's kind of going back to Jamie's thing earlier, is that, when he talked about the Sherpas and all of that, they're very innovative because they have to be, So when you are in adverse conditions, adversity is the mother of invention. And so they really do need to think about how to address very fundamental problems of food and getting water, clean water, getting access to medicines. So it's a very creative environment. For me, what's been amazing in the last couple of years, we have seen this adoption of technology and innovation. And just some examples. In Rwanda, they are using drones to deliver blood to some of the more remote and rural areas. The last mile tends to be extremely challenging, especially for healthcare commodities, and they're critically important for healthcare commodities because it actually is a matter of life and death. There's also some drone proof of concept that have been done in Madagascar around TB. There's some that's now being kicked off in Tanzania, and there's actually a drone corridor that has been sanctioned in Malawi. And for those of you that don't know where Malawi is, that's where Madonna went to adopt her children. So that's drones, that's just one thing. The other one is advanced analytics. So there is an organization here in the Bay Area called Zynesis that's actually working with the Ethiopian Ministry of Health to use advanced analytics to help them with their measles programs and to help them to understand outbreaks and to start to look at some predictive activities that they can do around material availability, campaigns, etc. We also have control towers. So Roddy and I had the pleasure to work on developing a blueprint for a control tower that is now being adopted, that was sponsored by the Gates Foundation, and it is now currently being adopted by 10 different countries to provide end-to-end visibility for health commodities within the different countries. And there's also a global control tower that's being used to provide visibility for the commodities coming from the manufacturers to the country. So, I mean, that's just a sense of the type of activities. And the wonderful thing for me is that we have this opportunity in Africa to leapfrog. And so what I predict is that you're actually going to see more advanced instances of applications like Oracle in emerging markets than you are in developed countries in the next few years.
It's a fascinating story. And by the way, what they call the BMGF, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Control Tower, they call a van, because you can imagine putting the control tower in Ethiopia and having visibility into Kenya or Nigeria's drug supply. So control tower, not a popular term. So what's a van? A visibility and analytics network. And I think it's a profound thought, because what you want is visibility, and what you want is to be able to analyze availability. So it is a great story. So, the point behind all the discussions here, Stuart starting off with, smart circuit breakers. I'm an electrical engineer. Who would have ever thought that your circuit breaker was going to talk to you? Well, maybe you want to switch off somebody's power when industry needs peak power, and you want to switch off the power for half an hour, and it's really not going to impact because it might be in the middle of the night. So this is really innovative thinking. And you talk about Maeve, you know, with drones delivering critical products, cold chain being able to track the fact that, you know, vaccines may have to travel in cold, and if it gets warm, you throw it all away. You know, Bob's point about getting stuck in 3. You know, from my experience, companies get stuck in 3 because they've got such massive complexity embedded into their data, into their systems. You just can't move fast enough. And we've had lots of discussions here about be careful you don't land up with 100 different cloud environments from different vendors because you've just created another problem. So, you know, how do you get out of 3? Well, you've got to make the mental model switch and start with demand, as you've heard from Stuart and everybody. You've got to start with the patient. You've got to start with the retailer. You've got to start with the person who's ultimately going to use your piece of equipment. And so the mental model switch. So how do companies get out of 3? You know, Procter & Gamble's in a 4. Why? Because the CEO said, there's 2 things we care about at P&G. Product's available, when we say it's available. And by the way, when we fix that, we want to understand why consumers choose and use our products. I would argue that every single supply chain is the same issue. I mean, did they think about that when they dropped the price of Nutella by 70%? And then there were riots in France because people couldn't get their Nutella product. And then, you know, Dave talking about the use of cameras halfway across the world with AI looking at somebody putting a garment together and not having somebody inspect it over their shoulder. You could sit and use it like a drone control center and be watching all the places, and the system's going to tell you, hey, you just selected the wrong sleeve to put onto that garment. So, you know, if you think supply chain's not changing and, you know, influenced by digital technology, the point is, are we ready in stage 4 to change the mental model? So Schneider, and I'm going to talk a little bit for Schneider, Schneider, Annette, who's the CEO of North America, but was the supply chain leader for Dell, she's already teaching the leadership team how to behave as a stage 4 leadership team. What does it mean to be a stage 4 leadership team? Even if you're a stage 2 organization, which I would argue most companies are. So once the leadership team can set the example, create the vision, then you're likely to get an end-to-end supply chain and make those transformations. So I know we got 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask very quickly just to rattle through one recommendation that each of you would make to the audience out there. Dave.
Well, I think one thing that you've highlighted and Maeve, I think, you know, reinforced is, you know, the idea of maturity model for a smaller organization. You could have years of detritus of just a lack of investment in technology. And the exciting thing about, you know, today from a technology capability standpoint is we can make leaps forward quickly. Cloud allows us to do that. So, you know, the ability for smaller organizations to take advantage of capabilities to effectively ride the coattails of larger organizations. I've never been more excited about the potential globally.
That's why I'm at Oracle. Bob.
The notion of transformational leadership that Damon brought up and then you brought up, we got to be careful here because right now business is damn good, all right? Across all global supply chains, the JP Morgan Manufacturing Index of supply chain activity is at, excuse me, a 6-year high. So all of you are feeling probably the effects of that. Everything's going great, okay? So there's a tendency to go heads down. We always do that. And that's the risk. Because if you go heads down and just get into this stuff right now, and you take your eye off that ball of where you got to go, when you put your head back up in about 6 months, guess what's going to happen? What Maeve talked about, others have talked about, these disruptors have made their leap.
Yeah, and it's interesting, sorry to interrupt you, it's interesting because a number of panels have come up with the ideas, when you implement an end-to-end supply chain solution in the cloud, understand that what's going to make you successful is introducing a continuous improvement culture. Because you're continually adjusting the supply chain. It's not about, I'm going to wait 2 years for the ERP vendor to deliver a new version of the software and then figure out how do I do this across 25 instances and I don't have master data. It's a nightmare. And that holds companies back. Maeve.
Two quick thoughts. One is that I really do believe that we need to move from this supply chain transformation, change management, to where organizations are adopting an evolution and the adoption of innovation, so that it's just a continuous process driven by continuous improvement. And the second thing is, as you are going through your supply chain transformation, think about what you will look like in 5 years' time and the skills that you now need to be working on that you will be using at that time.
That's a really good point. I mean, if you build the supply chain for today, then by the time you get there, it's all moving at such a rate, it's going to change. Damon.
So I'd say to echo, I think what everyone said, that what's the one constant is change. And change is happening faster than it ever has before. So when going down these paths, wherever you are on the evolution, you can't try anymore to figure everything out. Because by the time you figure it all out, something will have changed on you. And that didn't used to be the way with the larger ERPs and the larger technologies, but now to the continuous improvement and the fact that you can take advantage of these things every month, every 2 months. You can change more rapidly than you ever could before. So in doing that, you got to start to change the initial thinking and the visionary thinking up front that we aren't going to lay out a strategy for the next 5 years, because by the time it happens, it will be completely different. And I think that's key in getting moving on the journey.
And you're going live after 90 days on an application in the cloud, which wasn't even prioritized up front, but 90 days later it's working.
Yes,
and hopefully tomorrow, Friday's a good day for you.
Exactly.
Stuart.
Okay, so I think the external pressures that we feel from our customers and the awareness that is there is really pressing the innovation to explore the IoT and the cloud. But what we're finding is with that, it's bringing simplicity and it's bringing agility. It's bringing focus into the supply chain and into the business, which is outside driven. And it really does keep people, very focused on what needs to be done in the eyes of that customer. So that's what we're feeling.
Yeah, and I think just to close off, the final point is the pivot from inside out, right to left, based on traditional, lots of ERP systems and integration. The pivot from supply-driven to demand-driven is not trivial. So if you look at it from a simplistic point of view, why wouldn't I want a cloud in the end-to-end supply chain that gets updated, where I don't have to manage the services, where I could focus on process improvement rather than just cranking through this technology every day? So I would like to put our hands together for the panelists. Thank you very much.